So, the average person walks 150 million steps in a lifetime. But how many go somewhere new? I'm talking about those first steps, next steps, even missteps. The steps that move us all forward. Those are the ones that count. Let's keep walking.
The luxury you know just became more refined. The new Lexus ES. Refinement crafted.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see such a packed hall on a Monday evening, and that's really the power of conversations that we gather all together like this, whether it's weekends or weekdays. So thank you for being here. I'm Shoma Chaudhary. I'm the founder of Lucid Lines, and it gives me great pleasure to have all of you here today, to welcome you, and I'm just going to ask my colleagues to shut the door. It gives me immense pleasure to thank our presenting partners today. Shiv Nadar Foundation are literally the reason why all of us can gather here. Shiv Nadar Foundation is being created by the personal wealth of Mr. Shiv Nadar, who, as you know, is the founder of HCL, one of the largest technology companies in the country. And it is a foundation that's dedicated to the power of transformation through ideas, through education. They have fantastic colleges, colleges of eminence, institutions of eminence, a school right here in Gurgaon, in Noida, in Chennai. But they also extend this, the world-class sort of facilities to those who are underprivileged through their other wings of their foundation, the Shiksha Initiative as well as Vidya Gyan, which a friend of mine who visited said it was like the Don Bosco of those who are not economically advantaged. But that's the level of facilities. They have a huge community of more than 40,000 people, teachers, students, alumni, and they're a foundation that really believes in the power of ideas. They've backed this from the beginning. They back the arts, habitats, conservation, and truly the idea of responsible, engaged citizenship. So I'd really like you to give them a very warm applause for making this possible. Our other partners are Johnny Walker, Diageo, and again, of course, they're a great reason why all of us gather here in animated spirits, but it's not just the material of what they provide us, but again, their vision chimes deeply with the idea of ignition because they believe in the power of walking, keep walking, resilience, transformation, moving to a society that's inclusive, diverse, and embracing of all. And so, again, a wonderful partner for us. We have Lexus. Their beautiful car is in the lobby outside, so during the cocktails, please do go and have a look at it. It's the ES300H, which is a smart, hybrid, strong electric car. It's absolutely reliable. It runs on 60%. It doesn't need charging. It emits very low CO2. And it has huge, spacious interiors, very, very luxurious, done by Takumi craftsmen. And again, Lexus believes in an emotional experience, an emotional connection, luxury, reliability, and a commitment to the future. So again, as I said, it's not just a kind of statutory thank you, but a very deeply felt thank you, because every partner that's aligned with us believes in the idea of what we are doing. And so again, as I said, please don't blind spot them. Please shower love, because they are the reason we are able to do this. So please go and have a look at the car during the cocktail break. And their representatives, of course, are around here. We also have DLF, which, of course, in Gurgaon is almost eponymous. So I don't need to say anything very much about them. But they're synonymous with 21st century living, luxury living, all kinds of business offices and residences. But again, they are people who believe in creating communities, not just structures and cities, but the spirit that must imbue communities that come together. So it's wonderful to have DLF as our partner. We also have 7 Pillars, which is very apt because we have one of the most fit Indians on stage today who's going to be joining us later. But the 7 Pillars, again, stands for fitness as well as a luxurious experience. They have outlets in 5 centers in the city. They've also partnered with DLF in their clubs. And they are, as I said, synonymous with luxurious fitness, a preoccupation with many urban, we're all on the run, and they are kind of refuge, a temple of wellness. So their representatives are here as well. So do reach out to them during cocktails. And as I said, this is the whole ecosystem that makes this possible. I'd also like to thank my partner, Aditya Puri, who's really kept walking with me through many hills and troughs. So a big thank you to him. And also to the thank you. Also to the wonderful team at Lucid Lines. Earlier we were a very tiny team, and I used to take all of their names individually, but we are now a really young, vibrant team of almost 20. But there are a lot of young, animated minds that help put these together. And so I would urge you to go to our website and have a look at all of them, but I want to acknowledge them and thank them. And of course, there's Brand Avatar, who's our event partner. So a big thank you to all of them. And now the session that we've been waiting for. Before that, I just wanted to say something which really moved the idea of Lucid Lines and Ignition, and the reason we get together, is that words are events. Words are action. They change those who listen, and they change the speaker as well. And through words, really, history, politics, modern societies express themselves through the power of words. And that's why to celebrate that power is why we are gathered month on month over here. And that's why it gives me particular pleasure to have today the first session of the evening, which again has used words almost like a forensic. Its history leaves a lot of spoors that are kind of lost in time. And you need scholar detectives that can uncover those trails and make visible lost worlds. And it's not just lost worlds, but those worlds also impact our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of intersections, our understanding of dealings with others. And it is so important that then that is presented in a way that is not only riveting and compelling, but opens minds without a riptide of also anger and hatred. And that's what makes this book that we're here to celebrate so very special. The Golden Road is a book that casts light on how ancient India transformed the world across 1,500 years and possibly more as an empire of ideas. And what is so unique is that William Dalrymple, the historian that's written this book, has tracked how there was this immense diffusion of ideas ranging from Rome and Italy and Central Asia, China, all the way to Southeast Asia, and almost entirely without the use of the sword, without attack, a pure diffusion of ideas with the strength of its philosophy, with astronomy, maths, trade, religion, architecture, sculpture, soft power, globalized soft power at its very height. This is such an exciting book, and the person who's written it is again a kind of legend in his own right. Even more than all the sort of antecedents of him, what makes him legendary in India is his legendary love affair with India. from the very first book that he wrote, City of Jinns. He wrote In Xanadu before, and of course, we're going to talk about that as well a little bit. But he's mostly focused on medieval India, the last Mughal, the white Mughals. He's written about the Kohinoor. He wrote about the East India Company, the anarchy. And now he's trained his riveting storytelling eye to ancient India and what it meant for the entire world. So this is the first evening here that's going to literally launch his book. So I'm going to welcome him on stage. We'll open the book. And I feel a little bit like somebody whose exam has been stolen because I sped read the entire book. But Willie told me yesterday that he's going to do a presentation, which is going to make this a real visual treat. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Willie Dalrymple. Thank you, Willie. Thank you. We have books to open.
Well, there's no greater visual treat than Shoma, but I will have to offer some slides as a supplement. Here we go. There we go. Hillbone baby, there we go. The Golden Road, launched in India at Ignition. So Shoma has thanked everybody and their dog, but the one important person they've missed is the person who ever made those gulati kebabs. Now I understand why 600 people are here to... that you have the best gulati kebabs in Gurgaon and probably in Delhi too. Anyway.
Okay, I'm going to get off stage and I'll come back on later after you're done.
This book has its origins in this image. I was exploring a very different sort of book when this picture turned up on my phone. And it, as you can see, it's very obviously an image of the Buddha. But everything else about it is incredibly surprising. First of all, when it came out of the ground 4 years ago, the archaeologists recognized immediately that it was carved in something called Proconessian marble, which is the Lexus, the Johnny Walker, the ignition of the marble world. I'm hoping very much to get these sponsors onto Jaipur now. And that marble is mined not anywhere in India, but on an island in the Marmara opposite Istanbul. Secondly, the tortellini curls, as the archaeologists described them, these extraordinary version of the Buddha's curved hair, shows the use of a certain sort of drill which the archaeologists have been able to pin down to a particular workshop in Alexandria in Egypt. Thirdly, you can see behind the Buddha the rays of the sun. And this seems to hint at some sort of syncretism with either Mithras or Surya or Sol Invictus, the Roman sun god. But the most surprising thing about this Buddha head was that it was discovered by archaeologists in an Isis temple in Egypt on the Red Sea coast, where sailors from India used to arrive with their cargoes, bringing luxury goods to the Roman Empire in such quantities that the Roman geographer Pliny the Elder talks about India being the sink of all the gold in the world. This was the place where the world's gold ended up, because India produced these extraordinary luxuries that were incredibly exotic to the Romans. Now, I happened to receive the email which contained this picture 4 years ago when I was at the other end of the ripples of Indian influence and was exploring Angkor Wat just after lockdown. And as you can see, Angkor is normally packed with tourists. This was immediately the first week that it had opened up after COVID. And there were just a few Buddhist pilgrims there. And I was exploring, at that point, I was very interested in how all these Indian ideas had ended up in Southeast Asia. How Southeast Asia had taken on Sanskrit, ideas of Hindu kingship, various models of Hindu temple type, Hinduism itself. But receiving this email about a Buddha turning up in Egypt, 6,000 miles to the west of India, while looking at Angkor Wat 6,000 miles to the east of India, made me realize that there's, of course, a much bigger picture here, and that we have to look at both sides. That India is like an enormous, if you imagine a pool, a large pool, still and quiet, and you throw an enormous rock into it, the ripples that roll out from that. And one of the questions we have to ask is why, I think, do we not immediately associate India with the diffusion of ideas? Why are we not aware of the fact that place names all the way from Balkh in Afghanistan to Singapore are all Sanskrit names? Why is this something that we don't know automatically? Why does no one in the West know the names Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, but they do know the names Pythagoras and Archimedes? Every kid by the age of 6 in Britain knows the story about Archimedes and his bath, and Eureka and all that. But no one, literally no one. I've given this lecture now in Oxford and Cambridge and every other university town in Britain over the last 6 weeks. No one knows those names. Why is that? Well, the first answer is probably colonialism. It's only 150 years since Macaulay said that a single shelf of good English books is worth all the native literature of India and Arabia. Everyone laughs at that now, but the ripples of the influence of those ideas still haunt a lot of the West. And I think Indian ideas are not still understood to be as foundational as they actually are. But another idea which I think has obscured this is this map, which is very much something which my generation has taken in and taken on. And this is the map of the Silk Road, this horizontal line allegedly running through Central Asia from the coast. And notice how this is just taken at random from one of the many 40-odd books that are published a year about the Silk Road around the world. And this one happened, which I took at random, has the Roman names, Alexandria, Antioch, Palmyra. These are the names of cities that existed during Roman times. And it has this image of these caravan trails, very romantic idea of camels crossing the Himalayas, the Pamirs, and arriving at the Chinese court just on the edge of the South China Sea. But the more I've researched this book, the more I've come to realize that this idea of a Silk Road is an invention. Marco Polo never talks about the Silk Road. No Chinese source ever talks about the Silk Road. No Western source talks about the Silk Road before 1877, when a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen came up with the idea when he was designing a colonial railway running from Berlin to Peking, as it was then called. And it's an entirely invented idea which has been weaponized by the Chinese state over the last 10 or 15 years to become the basis for the Belt of Road, and has been used by them to project an image of Asia always facing towards China and always running on this overland route over the Pamirs, over the deserts. Now, memorize that map for a second in your minds and then compare it with this. This is a new map that came out of the Oxford Archaeology Department this summer, and it's a map of Roman coin hoards. As you can see, it's concentrated, as you'd imagine, in Italy, France, Spain, and Greece. Drifting off as you head northwards into Scandinavia and Scotland, a lot of coins found around the southern shore of the Mediterranean and the eastern shore, a little trickle running down the Nile into Africa, a few more in Yemen, and a couple up in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. But then, look at the bottom right-hand corner. India was the actual principal trading partner of ancient Rome. We know this from Pliny, we know this from Strabo. And in reality, if you look in the sources, India and China had no idea of each other's existence until probably the 7th or 8th century, after the fall of Rome. So those maps that predict an ancient route running to Roman cities, as we saw here, with these names like Tyre and Gaza and Antioch and Palmyra, which point to a Roman era connection across this route, are complete historical nonsense. India was the place which was the principal trading partner. Strabo, a Greek geographer based in Alexandria in the 1st century AD, talks about going on a tour of Egypt. He arrives at a place called... There is a fleet of 250 vessels that set off from this port every year. 250 vessels trading and aiming for Maziris in what's now Kerala. And this is what we're proposing as an alternative to this idea, this fraudulent and wrong-headed idea of a Silk Road. I'm quite happy to accept that there was an important overland trade route from the time when the Mongols punched a hole through Asia in the 13th century. And Marco Polo in 1271 does pass from the Mediterranean to Xanadu without hindrance because the Mongols had just removed all the borders in the middle. But up to that point, Persia and Rome were always in conflict, and it was very difficult for traders to pass over that border, as well as there being the simple fact that you can obviously pass far more in an enormous trading vessel than you can in the saddlebags of a donkey or a camel. So I'm proposing a new map, the Golden Road, which heads from the west coast of India up the Persian Gulf, but particularly up the Red Sea. And when Rome falls in the 5th and 6th century, that India pivots. There's a major economic crisis in the 5th century. India loses this source of easy gold. Pliny says it's the sink of all the gold in the world. So gold is pouring in for very cheap products such as pepper and ivory that Indians are able to produce very, very cheaply, and Romans spend a lot of money on. When that suddenly stops at the fall of Rome, and when the ports of Berenike and Myos Hormuz on the Red Sea are abandoned, the Tamil trading guilds that are now up and running pivot eastwards, and that's when they go and discover Suvarnabhumi, the lands of gold. And that is the Thai, Malay, the Isthmus of Kra, where there's gold there, Sarawak in Borneo, and other regions in this whole area becomes known as Suvarnabhumi. The whole area is known as the lands of gold. And the Tamil trading guilds set up little colonies with their own mercenaries. They're absolutely extraordinary institutions. They had their own guild of assassins who track down anyone that assassinate stray traders. So you didn't mess with these guys. They're sort of halfway to being the mafia already. And they take over the trade to the east. So this is the world that we're talking about. So there are three principal forms of the diffusion of Indian influence in this period. And the first, which we're going to talk about, is Buddhism. And just to rush through it very quickly, because I know Shoma is longing for a chit-chat and doesn't want me to sit and talk all evening, just to chat very briefly about this. The Buddha, obviously a historical character, probably lived in the mid-5th century BC, but bizarrely almost invisible archaeologically for 200 years. It's only when Ashoka converts to Buddhism in 250 BC that we suddenly start getting actual tangible signs of the spread of Buddhism. And very quickly it spreads from Lumbini, Sarnath, Bodh Gaya, the area where the Buddha lived, where it seems to have remained fairly isolated for the first 200 years, to the Deccan. This is Ajanta, the Padmapani, the wonderful early Indian cave monasteries at Bhaja, with the extraordinary 150 BC wood umbrella and the teak roof rafters dating from this early period. And Ashoka sends out his missionaries to the north and to the west as far as Cyrene, which is modern Libya. You have echoes of the Ashoka's inscriptions turning up in Anatolia. People are listening to the language and converting it into Greek. But most impressive results come in Sri Lanka, which converts to Buddhism immediately under Mahinda. And recently there's been some extraordinary archaeological discoveries, including the stupa of Mahinda on the right here, this very crude, very early, simple, early stupa, in contrast to the nice domed one on the left. Just turned up 2 years ago in the hill of Rajagala in central Sri Lanka with a Brahmi inscription saying Mahinda, just to prove the point. So Sri Lanka early on becomes a center of the diffusion of Indian culture, and very soon, by about 150 BC, this is the pattern that is developing. You've got major trade routes going in and out of India, up the Red Sea, heading towards Rome. The key at the top right is Tibet, because Tibet is the bellows that creates the winds, that creates India's maritime prosperity. This time of year, Tibet freezes over. Just as we're sitting here in the heat in Delhi, it's snowing now in Tibet. Winds break in to the cold mass of Tibet. Then, in the spring, it thaws, and warm winds blow outwards. And this inward-outward blow from Tibet creates the monsoon winds that we all know come here later and later at the moment, but still arrive in Delhi in June, and finally disappear now in about December, but originally in August. And those winds, once you learn to ride them, can take you in 2 months from Kerala to the borders of Egypt. Remember your literature lessons? Remember Antony Cleopatra? They commit suicide. Octavius Caesar seizes Egypt. Egypt is now the land border with India. And you can sail in just 2 months with the monsoon wind. If you leave in May, you can reach India, and then you have 6 months to do all your shopping, go and see the pyramids, go and see the circus in Alexandria, buy all the duty-free goods you wish. Then you catch the reverse winds coming back to India 6 months later. The same is true on the west coast. You can go down through the Malacca Straits to the Mekong Delta. It's not just Indians and Romans, you've got Ethiopians traveling. Look at this incredibly elegant, tall, courtly Ethiopian from Aksum, who's appearing in a South Indian court on this image on the left. But we know the figures thanks to this new discovery. This is the Muziris papyrus, found about 10 years ago, now in Vienna. What it contains is a shipping invoice for one container that happened to leave Kerala about 40 AD on a ship called the Hermapollon, a Greek ship. And we know everything that was in that container because it's an invoice. It also contains the customs taken by the Romans. So these are the things that India was selling the Roman Empire. This, incidentally, is a mosaic in Sicily. The central figure is a yakshi, modeled on one of these gorgeous yakshis from Matra, maybe, these voluptuous figures holding on to a tree. Do you see the tree on the top right? She's holding on to it on the left here. But round her knees is silk. What Pliny, a puritanical naval commander, a kind of very much a type you could find today propping up a bar in Bombay, says, harumphing, what are the decadent women of Rome doing, spending their money on this see-through material? And indeed, look, she's wearing it in such a way that you can actually see her lower leg in the silk. There is ivory in her hand. Behind her is pepper hanging from a tree. Circus animals were sold from the coast, elephants, tigers, and in the bottom right-hand corner is malabathrum, which was used in Roman perfumery. These are the main products that India was selling. And thanks to the Muziris papyrus, we know that one container on one ship in 46 AD left the coast of Kerala, and that had it reached Alexandria, and we don't know whether it did or didn't, but if it reached Alexandria safely, the man who imported it would have been rich enough to buy one of the largest estates in Egypt or in central Tuscany, and even had enough change left over to join the Senate. So you could become this sort of, you could become the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt if you could successfully bring a large container of ivory, pepper, silk, and cotton from India in the 1st century AD. And we see Indian products all over archaeological sites in the West, particularly this famous ivory yakshi found in Pompeii. But we also see the reverse. We see Roman objects coming up here. This is Roman glass in Alexandria. It was found under the American airfield in Bagram in excavations. And it shows that there were luxury products also coming from west to east, and it makes a great deal of difference to the art of the period. Gandharan art is strongly influenced by Roman art. Here we have, and Roman Egyptian art in particular, because it's out of Egypt that these boats are sailing. So here we have Isis suckling Horus in the middle. The Gandharan model takes that and turns it into Hariti, the Yakshi who used to eat children until she met the Buddha. Then she became a vegetarian and becomes the patron saint of Buddhist children. So the same imagery that you see in the center is used in Pakistan and Afghanistan. This is in the center, the Gandharan murals at Miran in Central Asia, and on left and right you have the Coptic monks from Egypt. Look at the way they do the chin. Look at the way the black and the red are used for the eyes. So you've got not just craftsmen and holy men, but apparently artists moving between these different parts of the world. And the top we've got in the National Museum in Delhi now, but originally from Gandhara, the Buddha and his disciples. Below, we've got the same image in a Coptic papyrus. Same imagery, different religion, different country, but the ideas are traveling between the two. But the big change that Roman art introduces is this, the image of the Buddha. Originally, in Buddhist art, the Buddha is aniconic. He's shown as a turban. He's shown as 2 feet. He's shown as a tree. Now, suddenly, he takes on the imagery of Apollo, and we find these incredibly handsome faces of the Buddha appearing all over Central Asia, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries AD. We used to think that Gandharan art was the result of the lost legions of Alexander stuck up in the Hindu Kush. But the timing doesn't work. The Bactrian Greeks have been wiped out by 150 BC. And these images begin in the 1st century AD and continue through the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, which is when these are sculpted. So these are modeled on Roman originals. On the left, we've got an image of Augustus. On the right, we've got a Gandharan image of the Buddha. And look how how similar the drapery is. These are the models. This is the result. So influence is heading in both directions. And these incredibly gorgeous images are influenced both by the art of Mathura and the ideas of India and by the art of Rome. But Buddhism, bringing with it a whole baggage of Indian literature, language, mythology, ideas of cosmology, ideas of geography, the ideas of how we measure the world, how we look at the world, how we measure time. This is heading northwards into China. One of the ideas which I think moves from India to the Mediterranean world is monasticism. Here we have Bamiyan with all the monks' caves. Now you begin to get this appearing in the Roman world. At the fall of Rome, you have the rise of Christian monasticism, also in the desert, also living in caves. But this sort of monasticism had been common in India for 300 years before it takes off in the Mediterranean. And where does it start? It starts on the Red Sea coast, just near Berenike, where that Roman Buddha first is sculpted. So you've got ideas of monasticism, asceticism, living in communities, in caves, in the desert, passing from one world to the other, and going on up into China, where from the beginning you find the Chinese features to the Buddha. Buddhism first reaches China in the 1st century AD. It's a minority faith associated with foreigners and merchants. By the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, you're beginning to get Indian artistic ideas like this image of the Buddha from Mathura, just south of here, being copied in Central Asian Chinese images like this one on the right. Indian Gadavaras and Apsaras begin to swim and fly over the domes of Chinese monasteries in Gansu, heading ever eastwards. And some of the monks are clearly smoking something quite strong, judging by these images, but we'll pass over that. And by the 5th century, it's reached the court in Chang'an. And you have these images from the Tang period of Buddhist courtiers in the court. And the figure who changes everything is someone familiar from Indian history textbooks, the wandering Chinese monk Xuanzang, with his natty little backpack full of scrolls. Do you see the scrolls in the back of his backpack? He comes because he wants to learn the real uncorrupted texts of Buddhism. Where from? From the monastery of Nalanda. Now, Nalanda, as you can see, has exactly the plan of a modern Oxbridge College. You have a courtyard, a cloister garth, and the scholars' rooms on the side. But most of all, as far as Xuanzang is concerned, when he arrives in the mid-7th century, it's the 9-story library full of not just all the sacred texts of Buddhism, but also the Vedas, mathematics, science, astronomy, astrology, and this extraordinary 9-story monastery library still survives, but only 1/10 of Nalanda has been dug. Why the government of India is not giving huge sums of money to archaeologists to uncover what was the Nazar, the Oxbridge, the Ivy League of ancient India is beyond me, because this is the most extraordinary institution. You have a copper plate here from the king of Srivijaya, which is Indonesia, with this, which is in the National Museum, records the founding of expatriate colleges for monks from Southeast Asia coming to Bihar to study. We know the names of monks who came from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Korea, and even Japan. So this is a major intellectual institution, and it's sitting in the middle of Bihar, and people are coming from across Asia to be part of it. Xuanzang spends 20 years in Nalanda, gathering texts, copying out manuscripts, commissioning copies from other copiers. He gets back to China, and he forms an unlikely alliance with this woman. This is the Empress, well, it will become the Empress Wu Zetian, but when Xuanzang makes it back to China, she's just a 5th-ranking concubine who has just entered the harem of the Emperor Taizong, and she's only 15 years old. But she's Buddhist, and she and Xuanzang form an alliance because Buddhists are a minority. They're a small part of the court. Everyone else is Confucian or Taoist. And these two work together. Xuanzang encourages Wu Zetian, and Wu Zetian gradually rises from a 5th-ranking concubine. When Taizong dies, she's already become the lover of the crown prince, Gaizong. A year after his father is dead, after Taizong has disappeared from the scene, the Empress Wu Zetian is brought back from the nunnery into which she's been put and made the 1st-ranking concubine. And you understand it all a bit better when you see the images from the Chinese soap opera. She's a very famous figure there, 250-part soap opera called The Empress of China, because she's the only woman in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history who becomes not empress consort, not dowager empress, but a woman emperor. How does she do this? She does this by kicking out the Confucians and the Taoists and replacing them at court with Nalanda-trained Indian and Chinese Buddhist monks. There's like a Mahayana Buddhist coup d'etat in the heart of the Chinese court, bringing Buddhism to become the state religion of China. It's an extraordinary story and one that's never taught in this country. And it's, if you like, the high watermark of Indian influence in China. This woman, when Gaizong has a stroke, becomes the acting emperor. And when he dies, she uses her Buddhist scholar team who she's trained up in a sort of think tank called the Scholars of the Northern Gate. And she brings them into power, she brings them into play very cleverly, and they predict that she is actually the incarnation of a whole variety of promised Buddhist saviors, and that she will save China. And they build a whole new town in memory of her and these various prophecies which she's meant to embody. It's a huge hokum. They pay anyone that reports, auspicious signs. But she pulls it off. And for 50 years, she rules China. She turns it into a Buddhist nation. And this is the high watermark of Indian influence in China. At this period, Indian ideas of geography, astronomy, maths, astrology, ideas of Jambudvipa, ideas of different kalpas and yugas enter the Chinese lexicon. Meanwhile, a similar thing is going on in Southeast Asia. When Rome falls, the Tamil trading guilds begin to look eastwards. They look to Okeo, they look to Champa, they look to Guangzhou. And there is this extraordinary moment when these Indian ships begin to cross down the Malacca Straits into Southeast Asia. All over Thailand, you find these extraordinary wheels of the law modeled on originals in Sarnath in UP, but now built in Thailand. And in the Mekong Delta, huge fleets of Tamil trading ships, more from Orissa, others from Tamralipti in Bengal, begin to arrive, searching for trade. And if you can't move down these canals, which still exist 2,000 years later, you arrive at the hill of Angkor Borei, and on that is the first Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. Within it are these extraordinary sculptures of Vishnu. Now, from the beginning, it sort of is the Vishnu we recognize, and yet not so. There is a conch shell, there is a discus, but his physiognomy is Khmer, and he's wearing a sampot, the lungi of Cambodia. From the beginning, you find emperors depicting themselves as gods. So Jayavarman II, the founder of the Angkor Wat dynasty, has himself depicted as Lord Vishnu. I don't think there's any examples of that in India. Correct me if I'm wrong. His wife is depicted as Durga. And this is what's going on. You have the local ruler in Southeast Asia, and suddenly he's surrounded by usually Tamil Brahmins. They are performing Abhisheka ceremonies, as is taking place here, with water being poured over his head. And they are renaming these local rulers with names like Suryavarman, Mahendravarman, protected by the sun, protected by Mahendra. And suddenly he's a Hindu king connected to Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva. He is using the local, I haven't got it here, the local Tamil script. And what you find is that the Brahmins, who are not meant to cross the waters, fiddle it. And they convert the waters of Southeast Asia into a new Ganga. So at the spring at Phnom Da, you find lingams and yonis carved into the source. And the Mekong is renamed, and Mekong is just Ma Ganga pronounced in a Khmer accent. You find copies of Hindu temples. So here is the Shore Temple in Mahabalipuram, copied here 5 years later in Gedong Songo in Java, in a volcano. But it isn't identical. Look, there's a slightly curving Chinese eaves to the finials. You find these tall gateways that are slightly different. You begin to have women Brahmins. There is no caste. People eat pork. So it's Hinduism, and yet it's not the Hinduism we recognize. You have here in the old site of the Dieng Plateau, 46 Pallava temples erected, very similar to those in Kanchipuram. Here is the slide I was looking for. The Tamil Brahmi script, sometimes known as Pallava Grantha, is introduced and becomes the basis for every single script in Southeast Asia. Lao, Thai, Pew, Khmer, and so on. We'll race forward because I know Shobha wants to get on. Just to finish off, so we have images now growing the largest Buddhist temple in the world at Borobudur, the largest Hindu temple in the world at Angkor Wat. Not in India, but at Angkor Wat. 4 times the size of Vatican City, the outer moat enclosing this extraordinary building. But again, unfamiliar. Tagore, when he goes to Angkor, says, I saw India everywhere, but I could not recognize it. So it's kind of India, and yet it's not. Finally, last idea before we let Shobha back onto the stage again, the idea of zero, Indian math. So that the last section of the book is how the Guptas produced this extraordinary renaissance in mathematics, bringing not only the ideas of Vedic mathematics, but mixing them with the Yavana Sutras, with Babylonian and Persian forms of Buddhism. You get the 2 extraordinary figures of Aryabhatta, and after him, Brahmagupta, the circumference of the Earth, the distance of the Earth from the sun, the fact that the Earth is spinning on its own axis is Aryabhatta's contribution. Brahmagupta takes ideas of sunya, the void, and comes up with precise mathematical definitions of zero. Zero being around as a placeholder, but it is precisely defined by Brahmagupta. And these extraordinary Gupta innovations, which you see initially at Udaygiri and Ujjain in the great observatories, are taken forward. And within a few hundred years, you're getting zero written. That is the first written zero in the world. It's actually in Southeast Asia, this particular stela. It's from Siem Reap. It's in the second line. It's the dot between the 2 tadpoles in the middle. 100 years later, you get exactly the zero we use today, the polo mint-shaped zero in Gwalior. It's a very mundane inscription about the number of marigolds somebody has to give the temple, but this is the oldest dated one that survives. There's also the Bakshali manuscript now in Oxford, which is under scholarly dispute, but may date back far further. And this is the thing that should be on every Indian... hang on, it's disappearing. Here we are. This should be on every Indian school book. This is how the Brahmi numbers of Ashoka develop through to those of Gwalior, which is the slide I just showed, and trifurcate, if you like, into modern Devanagari, the Eastern Arabic numbers that we call, that we see in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and the Western Arabic numbers developed in Morocco and Spain, which become the European numbers that we all use today. How do they get to the Arab world? Improbably a Disney character is involved here. This is Jafar from Aladdin. He's a historical character. He's from the family, the Barmakids, who were Buddhist abbots and Sanskrit literate and used Indian mathematics. They convert to Islam, and when they become viziers in Baghdad, they send to Sind for the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, and they arrive in 776 in a great ceremony. And the Barmakids bring in not just Indian books of mathematics, but also books of Indian Ayurvedic medicine and various other forms. And it's a generation later that they're all pulled together by a man from Khiva, which was called by the Persians Khwarazm. He writes the snappily titled The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing using Hindu Calculation. Now, that's all too much of a mouthful, so people know the book as Al-Jabr, which is the basis of our world, algebra. His name, Al-Khwarizmi, becomes the basis of our word algorithm. And these travel around the entire Islamic world from the 9th century onwards. They are the basis of Islamic astronomy, astrology, along with chess, also an Indian invention. They eventually arrive in Spain. So you have on the right Sind, in the middle Baghdad. All this passes on to Spain, and by the 9th century, you've got Christian academics from universities and monasteries in Europe coming to Spain to learn this new number system. But in actual fact, it remains only the preserve of a handful of scholars until the 12th century, when a kid born in Pisa, which is halfway up the western coast of Italy, goes to Algeria, just below it, as part of his father's family. The father is founding a Pisan trading colony in Algeria. The kids go to school in Algeria, and just like my kids learned Hindi when they went to school locally here, so these kids learn Arabic and and the Al-Khwarizmi's method of Hindu calculation. The guy goes back to Italy and finds that everyone in Italy is still using MCV XV1 times VVCCM. And so he decides to write a book to explain this all to them. And the character is called Fibonacci. This is the kid who was brought up in Algeria, Leonardo of Pisa. And his book is called the book of what can you remember what it's called, my love? I've lost it. Liber Abaci, the Book of Numbers in Latin. First edition is, sorry, I'm galloping to a conclusion. The Liber, when you got 1 more minute, Shoba, 1 more minute. The numbers, the first edition is taken up by Frederick II. He's taken to court, and there he meets a Scotsman. This is why I didn't want to leave the stage quite yet. He meets a Scotsman called Michael Scott. Michael Scott says it's all too highfalutin, all this theoretical stuff, Fibonacci. You need to make it more practical. So he adds in the second edition money conversion, double accounting, currency conversion, weights and measures. And it's that second edition of the Liber Abaci that spreads around Italy, becomes the basis of Indian numbers taking hold in Europe. The Medici get hold of it and begin the banking dynasty. It's the basis of European banking. And so you can argue, ultimately, that it is Indian numbers that leads to the rise of the European corporation that eventually brings European corporations back to India with the East India Company. But that is another story for another day. Welcome, Shopa.
You know, a book has done its deed when the reader becomes more passionate than the author, you know. And I want to kind of mediate all the fantastic characters and stories in the book. You know, you gave us a visual sense of what the book covers, Willie, but I really wanted to share with the audience some of the absolutely amazing characters. And what, for me, was so exciting in the book was that you really, it's almost like a trade of ideas, you know, and that huge rush of ideas going around the world, that map that you showed. I wanted to bring some of the energy of that into the audience as well, so that they all rush out to buy your book. You know?
I can only encourage that.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, now we have very little time, so I'm going to touch on just a few ideas. I want to actually come to the Bahram kids, because that really struck me as such a fascinating story, because this is during, you know, the Abbasids and Caliph Mansur in Baghdad, and you have Muslim custodians who were actually Buddhist keepers of the Navavihara in Afghanistan, and they are translating Sanskrit, maths, for a Muslim world that will eventually, like you said, become the basis of the Italian world. You know? So can you talk to the audience a little bit about the very colorful story of the Bahram kids? And secondly, that Sanskrit was the vehicle through which even Buddhist ideas were being propagated, you know, across the world.
So the Bahram kids are this family, and they run a monastery that Xuanzang stops in on his way to India, when he's on his way to Nalanda. And he says the greatest library outside Nalanda is Naubaha, which is Balkh, in Afghanistan, now in northern Afghanistan. And when the first armies of Islam reach, they reach the Indus, and they also reach Balkh. It goes slightly to the east in Afghanistan, the first Arab conquest. And these guys pragmatically just convert to Islam straight away, other than one member of the clan who is studying mathematics in Srinagar. Yep. He comes back, and the Arabs who allow the Mamlukids, because they've converted and because they've submitted without a fight, they allow them to continue ruling Naubaha as long as they send the tax revenues to Rasafa. But they want hostages. So this kid who's just trained in Kashmir, who's called Barmak, Barmak is the family name, and it's a Arabicization of the Sanskrit word pramukh, and boss, if you like. Yeah. So this guy goes to Rasafa, and he ends up in class with all the other hostages who are princes from around the conquered world, Persians, Arabs, Alexandrians, and so on. And in the class is the current caliph's son, also the guy who will eventually rise up and overthrow him is called Al-Mansur.
Yeah.
Al-Mansur links up with Barmak, and Barmak becomes the Indian accountant, if you like, running the finances of the revolutionary army.
Yeah, so, but the core story that I wanted you to share, William, like I said, I've become a more passionate purveyor of his book than himself, is that fascinatingly, like I said, this is the beginnings of the high period of the Muslim, the Abbasids, and they're looking for science and, knowledge.
So
and
the Barmakids
the
are given
key
the task of planning Baghdad. So it's a bunch of Sanskrit literate former Buddhists who plan the circular city of Baghdad. Circular cities being an Indic city plan.
And the core book that, they actually sent out emissaries to look for is the Great Hind Sindh, so do share that with the audience.
So the Sindh Hind is what the Arabs call it. It seems to have been an edition of Brahmagupta that contained Brahmagupta's two books. First of all, his early book on mathematics, and his slightly later book written later in his life in Ujjain when he ran the astronomy there, possibly with the works of Aryabhatta attached to it. This book is brought to Baghdad in 776. We have multiple descriptions of it arriving, and Sanskrit...
Along with a Brahmin called Kanika.
Exactly.
Kanika.
And because these Sanskrit mathematical texts are so complex, and on top of everything else, they're written in poetry so that they can be memorized. And no one can really make head or tail of them unless they have a commentary. But in this case, Kanik, the Indian, as he's called, comes to, along with other Brahmins, to explain this. And somebody called Al-Fazari produces the first translation, which clearly isn't up to scratch because no one really understands it. It's only when Al-Khwarizmi unravels it further, a generation or two later, that it becomes very popular.
So this passionate search for books, Willie, really caught my attention. Willie was talking about this Chinese empress who really is worth like 7 Bollywood films, actually. And she murdered everybody she killed. She's reviled by later historians. But what was fascinating, you talked about how she legitimized her rule with Brahmins and with Buddhist priests coming from India. She called herself the Chakravartin, But again, there I wanted you to share with the audience the story that even she was sending out emissaries across to go look for particular Indian manuscripts, and she goes down on her knees and she says, I'll translate this. So talk about that,
So today, we can just go online and we can find almost anything almost immediately. But it takes now a leap of imagination to imagine a world when you might have to travel 6,000 miles to find what you want. So Xuanzang particularly wants something called the Yogacara texts, which are a particular group of late Mahayana philosophy, which he could not get anywhere in China. And so he makes this journey over the Pamirs, through the deserts, nearly dies, escapes arrows, escapes bandits, is nearly sacrificed at Durga Puja at one point, and escapes all that, gets to Nalanda, and spends 20 years translating all this stuff. And in the same way, once he leaves Nalanda, he has a whole chain of elephants and camels carrying these texts. He gets them back to Chang'an, the Chinese capital, and there they build something called the Wild Goose Pagoda that still stands in Chang'an. You can go and see it today, which was the repository of all these sutras. Yeah. And you then find monks coming from Korea and Japan to read the Chinese translations of these texts. Of the
Sanskrit, yeah.
And Wu Zetian sits a generation later with all these texts now in Chang'an and is involved in this huge business of translating these very complex Buddhist philosophical texts out of Sanskrit into Chinese, which are two very incompatible language systems. They have nothing in common.
Yeah.
And translating abstruse, abstract philosophical ideas from one to the other is a very, very tricky task. But Xuanzang is the man for the job, and he gathers around him this group of scholars that continues into the reign of Wu Zetian.
So, again, there's this commonly held belief that with Buddhism came Pali, and that became the language of the ordinary people. But again, what struck me in your book was an absolute discovery for me, was that all of this was actually being transmitted in Sanskrit,
There's also Pali too, but Xuanzang is Sanskrit literate. He learns Sanskrit. And so he particularly aims at the Sanskrit manuscripts, and those are the ones that he tends to take back to.
And even in the Abbasids, with the Caliph Mansur and with Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, all of that was being transmitted in Sanskrit at that time. And there's a constant repetition in the book that at that point in the medieval world and even 200 BC, you know, when there's references to Indian astronomers, Calenus, there was the sense that to understand astronomy, astrology, maths, philosophy, that Sanskrit was the language of knowledge. You know,
but again, I think it's very important to emphasize that in today, as in the past, as today, ideas don't come out of nothing. New advances tend to come when everyone gathers all that we know in one place and then takes it a leap further. So what you find that in Nalanda, they're having, as well as the Vedic mathematics and all this sort of stuff, they've got the Persian, the Babylonian, the Yavana Sutras, as they call them, the Greek works. And this renaissance that takes place during the Guptas comes during a period when India is uniquely open to outside ideas, which it then takes forward and advances. So it's not like it's sort of, there's sometimes an idea, there's two ideas that I tried to take on in this book, which were from the Hindu nationalist historians of the 1930s are fond of. One is the idea of R.C. Majumdar that there were Hindu colonies which were fought by the sword and created in Southeast Asia. No one believes that today. There were no conquests until the Chola period, when you get in 1016 and 1025, large-scale Chola raids and a brief period of Chola domination. But it's not, what's remarkable about the Indian spread of ideas is it's not passed, as you said in your introduction, by the sword. It's passed by the sophistication of the ideas alone.
Yeah.
And so you get this passage of ideas coming out of India, following trade routes, missionaries, Brahmins, following these routes, and on the heels of merchants come these advances. But the other idea which I try to take on is the idea that it's sort of India alone developing these ideas.
Yeah, it's an interaction.
India bringing the language, the learning of the world into India and then taking it forward. And it's in the periods when India is most open to outside ideas that you get the great advances taking place. When you look at the Ajanta caves,
yeah, I was just going to come to
there's all
that.
these incredibly multinational groupings of people in these caves. We think of ancient India as something sort of hermetically sealed off. The whole point of it is it wasn't.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd again like to hugely globalized.
So I'd love to share with the audience that the trigger point, Willie, you know, you mentioned it, you showed that one statue, but for me, again, a massive discovery, and again, a sort of reflection about what we should actually be proud about and start focusing on, was that he said that in the Ajanta caves, you know, in Cave 12, the ASI, you know, cleaned...
10.
Sorry?
Cave 10.
Yeah, Cave 10, that they cleaned up these paintings, which you showed briefly, and do share with, you know, this will be talking 250 BC. It's the first paintings that we know of where, you know, and then the kind of cosmopolitanism that it shows. You know, do share that. I found that fascinating.
There are two periods of painting at Ajanta. Cave 1, which is actually the slide I showed, is about 650 AD, or 550 to 650. And what precedes that, at 150 BC, is two caves, Cave 9 and Cave 10. And those two caves are 750 years earlier. In other words, the same distance as the Lodi Garden tombs to Gurgaon today. It's a massive period of history. And these two earlier caves contain the oldest Buddhist paintings in the world. This whole project kicked off for me partly when I went down there a few years ago, 10 years ago now, and saw all these paintings that were not familiar.
If you're going to write 1,500 years of history, you have to speak faster, Willie. I have so many things to ask you and time's running out.
Anyway, these paintings were restored
I want Scottish speed now. You know?
We need some more whiskey in that case. These paintings were restored by a guy called Manager Singh 10 years ago. And the ASI, being the ASI, they did a job beautifully, but they didn't tell anyone. Yeah. And these were the oldest surviving Buddhist paintings in the world, the oldest surviving paintings after Bhimbedkar in India. And they were just there, and no one had written about them. So the first work I did for this book was writing up.
Yeah, but tell the audience what you saw there. You know, I mean, they're Persians, they're Ethiopians, they are Parthians, they're Romans.
So
it's
you
incredible.
get this impression of a very, very cosmopolitan Indian from the beginning. And that's why all these ideas are coming in, stimulating new ideas, producing, catalyzing change.
Right. So, you know, I want to just touch some of the big ideas in your book, Willie. I could go on and on about the characters, and like I said, this absolutely fascinating highway of ideas. One is that, you know, you wanted to debunk the Silk Road. And you say that, you know, that's just pure fantasy and it's bunkum. So
it was there from the 13th century, but
came
as an
later.
early thing. Yeah.
Right. And then the Golden Road that you speak of is actually the golden waves, you know, it's the monsoon, it's the maritime trade. So,
maritime trade routes, exactly.
So one is that why did you want to set up this opposition with the Silk Road and the Golden Road? You know,
because one existed and the other didn't.
Okay. And
well, we have, I mean, you saw that map of, if we could go back to the slides.
No, they've seen it. They've seen it. I have too many questions.
The extraordinary image of the Roman coins with. And you can see, India is linked to Rome, and there's nothing in China. There's absolutely not a single Roman coin hoard in China.
Right.
So you wonder where this myth came from. And it's an example of how scholars and historians can follow each other down a blind alley for 100 years. And then someone actually does some work, charts these things on a map, and you can see it's simply myth.
Yeah. You know, it's fascinating when we were seeing that coin stash that, you know, and Pliny the Elder says this, or where did you get this statistic, that 1/3 of the Roman Empire was paid for by Indian trade, you know, so that
statistic is out of the Muziris Papyrus. Those figures that papyrus had been worked up by economic historians. In the current new edition of the Oxford Book of the Roman Economy, they're suggesting that maybe 1/3 came not just from India, but from the Red Sea trade, which included the frankincense trade from Arabia, it included right. Sri Lanka, it included Ethiopia. But the customs haul from the Red Sea customs produced 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget. Hadrian's Wall, the Algerian forts, the road networks, 1/3 of all that was paid for by the imports from India.
So now just to situate this book in our time, Willie, a couple of things which actually disturb me, and I think it needs to be discussed, is that when this book came out, there's obviously a lot of excitement. You know, it's historically, it's meticulous, you know, so there's a kind of immense credibility to the story that you're mapping. But there was a sense that, oh, this is going to play into the current political environment and that it, you know, and for me, that's very disturbing because for one to want to not look at your own ancient history just because it plays into any modern narrative is, and I don't even understand what it means in terms of plays into, but did that worry you? How did you think about it? And how would you like to kind of position the book now?
Well, I think there is this sort of weird perception that if you study the Mughals, somehow you're a Marxist. And if you study ancient India, you're suddenly a member of the RSS. Yeah. I mean, obviously, that's bullshit. So, yeah. So I think we can ignore that straight away. All history is there to be studied. If you study it in a credible and academic manner using primary sources, you can change the way people look at history.
Yeah, and this was long overdue. You know, like you said, it's been history hiding in plain sight. You know, that.
I mean, it's all there. We can see it. The fact that Buddhism reaches Mongolia, Siberia, that it's half the world's population today lives in countries where Indian ideas were either dominant now or once were dominant. And it's not like, we know that when you go to Angkor Wat, you see the Battle of Kurukshetra, you see the Battle of Lanka. We know that when you go to Laos, you see endless images of the Ramayana. When you go to Bali, that there are Hindus. I mean, none of this is a secret. But it's just putting it together and, in a sense, fighting back against received ideas like the Silk Road, which actually have very little academic credibility.
So, was there a sense that, a lot of the book focuses on the Buddhist diffusion of ideas. And again, it was very interesting, the Guptas, which was really the high period when so much of this basis of philosophy and maths and, astronomy, sculpture, the Kalidasa, all of that was happening during that time. But you said that there's almost no archaeological trace except in Udaigiri, of the Gupta period.
I didn't say that. No, I said that it's frustratingly elusive compared to the Kushans. There's a lot more stone bits and bobs of the Kushans lying around. No, I mean, there's plenty of Gupta stuff out there if you go around UP. There's many hundreds of sites. But it's elusive, and you have to look for it. And I'm sure if more money is put in years to come into the ASI, the underfunding of the ASI is one of the great scandals of this country. That you have this government that claims to be very proud of its history, which puts no money into the research of archaeology.
And also, you know, again, another...
only 1/10 of Nalanda has been excavated. It should be a national scandal.
Yeah.
This is, you know, there is 9/10 of that university waiting out there to be dug. Why do we not have 2,000 archaeologists digging there tomorrow morning?
You mentioned that, and another thing which struck me when you're talking about this whole diffusion of ideas, that apparently only 1/10 of extant Sanskrit manuscripts have been translated. You know, that even that is a whole project waiting to be done, and that hasn't been looked at. But coming, Willie, to two quick questions, because we're going to run out of time, is that, so you start with the whole diffusion of Buddhism and, you know, the way it carried, and again, fascinatingly, it's actually traders that carried ideas of Buddhism. Though it was a monastic religion, it's the traders who are really taking those stories. But, you know, they're possibly even more ancient knowledge systems, you know, coming from the Vedas and etc. When you were doing this, did you not find any footprint of that? Is all of that kind of lost in time?
Footprint of?
In terms of that going out into the world? Of predating the Buddha, say the Vedas or any of that?
So, the great diffusion of Indian ideas, as far as I can see, happens from the time of Ashoka onwards. I might be wrong about this and would be happy to be proved wrong, but while you certainly have examples of Hindu temples in Afghanistan, for example, there are many Durga temples that predate this in Afghanistan, the great diffusion outwards begins at that point. And this is what this is not a book about India. This is a book about how Indian ideas moved out from here. Yeah. So I've started the book with that.
Right.
Future generations may well be able to point to things earlier. But it's quite, for example, there is a whole locked debate among academics about how far ancient Greek philosophy and Vedic thought interrelate with each other. It's very much still in the academic discussion, and nothing can be said with... The only example that we have of a Greek who clearly and unequivocally was following Indian ideas is Philo. And Philo was a part of Alexander's army that invaded what's now Pakistan and Afghanistan. At Taxila, they meet what the Greeks called the gymnosophists, who seem to be Jains.
That's a fascinating story.
Because they start naked. So I presume that they're...
Yeah, but you should tell that to the audience with more color. Then Alexander meets these 15 gymnosophists who are stark naked. They have arguments over Socrates and all of that. And then they dine with Alexander, again stark naked, eating on one foot. And then one of them goes back with the Greek army. And when he falls ill, he flings himself into the pyre. And there's a contemporary account which says he doesn't flinch at all, you know. So,
but there's another one who doesn't throw himself into a pyre, called Philo. And he continues to stand in one pose for long hours. So he seems to be the first Western yoga instructor right. who went back to Athens. No one in Athens seems to have sort of got out their yoga mats and followed him. Okay. And he was regarded as a stray eccentric. But he was definitely part of Alexander's army, and he went back to Athens and went into these attitudes for long periods of time. And he said that the true philosophy is one that dispenses both with pleasure and pain, which sounds like some sort of version of Jainism or Buddhism.
Yeah. So the other idea that you put out is that, you know, and this again I wanted to ask you, we literally have 2 minutes, Willie, is that, you know, you say that possibly, and when you're reading your entire book, and like you said, you're really taking in 1,500 years of a diffusion of ideas, fascinatingly without any violence. It's literally through trade, through, like I said, like emperors sending out emissaries to look for one manuscript. Amazing stuff, you know. And then there's really is a very violent rupture, which is when the Ghaznis and the Ghurids come in, you know, the Gauris come in. And you've touched upon that in the book. And I think, again, it's important that one can speak of that with truth and then not connect it with modern-day Muslims who have no control over what Gauri or Ghazni was doing. But you put out another very interesting idea where you say it's not really the Gauris and Ghaznis which broke and ruptured this diffusion of ideas from India or the globalized idea of India, but it's the Mongoloid invasion that happened.
It's as much the Mongoloid. What the Mongols do is very important. There's 2 or 3 things they do. First of all, they destroy all the great cities of Central Asia and Afghanistan, so Balkh, Merv, all these great centers of learning. And many of the refugees end up in Delhi. So when you go to Hauz-Khas and you see the Hauz-Khas monuments, that is a great madrasa dating from the period of the Mongol invasions that we know was filled with expatriate professors from Central Asia. And this is the period when suddenly Persian arrives as the language of learning in this part of the world. And you get a Persianate academic class teaching and working and writing in Persian at that period. Secondly, you get the hostile border with Central Asia. So while Buddhist monks and traders were going backwards and forwards up the Hindu Kush, crossing like Xuanzang did, like all these Japanese did, like all these Korean monks did, coming down to Nalanda, suddenly the Mongols create a hostile border. So the Khaljis and the Mongols are at war, and that is a no-go zone. So you get double thing, and then you get the combination of the arrival of Persian and the cutting of the trade routes in the Mongol period seems to me as important as the Ghaznavids. So it's the double thing. It's the arrival of these various Turkish sultanates, which had reached by 1300, reached as far south as Madurai. We often forget there was a Sultanate of Madurai deep down in Tamil Nadu as early as 1300, along with the Mongol invasions. Genghis Khan turns back. He never actually destroys North India in the way that he did destroy everywhere else.
Oh yeah, that's another fascinating story you must share. Yes.
Because he sees a rhinoceros. India was saved by a rhinoceros, and he thinks it's an evil omen and a demon, so he goes off and burns Poland instead. Right. So you have a lot to owe to a single rhinoceros.
That's a good reason to protect the rhino, you know. Just one last thing, again talking about the lens of history, Willie, is that, again, it struck me that, you know, one keeps speaking of Alexander as Alexander the Great, but he burnt Persepolis, which was, again, an immense center of learning and civilization, and he never gets any bad epithets attached to him. And then there's so many burning of so many other places, you know, and the Cholas actually burned Sri Lanka and Anuradhapuram. But other than that...
And the Pallavas.
But other than that, I think the massive takeaway from this book, which should reinforce modern India and our conception of ourselves, is that for 1,500 years, India, like you said, was the economic, civilizational fulcrum of the, you know, of this very large world, and none of it was through swords or through domination, but purely by the sheer intellectual power of what it was trading in. You know, so
I think that's very important, and I think it's a much greater claim to fame to be an empire of the spirit. The Indosphere, which is what I call this great pool of Indian influence, is passed by the sheer power of Indian ideas. It's not passed by armies, by legions, by slavery, by crushing other people underfoot. Overwhelmingly, it's passed by merchants, missionaries, intellectuals, Brahmins, and stories. The popularity of the Mahabharata, the earliest existing text of the Mahabharata was found near Kashgar in Central Asia. The Ramayana spreads right out through Laos, through Java, through the whole of Indonesia. And these are extraordinary achievements. The first, we were rushing through the slides, so we didn't stop for a moment. The first 150 image sequence of Ramayana sculptures is not in India, but at Prambanan in modern Java, Indonesia.
Yeah. No, even the stories of Shiva and Parvati and Kushan in Afghanistan, it's a fascinating, globalized canvas. It's really like a detective thriller. I really would urge everyone to buy it. Before we end, Willie, Montek said that, he's sitting right here, and he said he had a tiny bone to pick with you in this otherwise magnificent book. So I'm going to give him a chance to say what it was that was...
I can't take on Montek. I surrender before he even asks his question.
Will somebody just give him a mic, please, right here? Oh, Montek, why don't you use it?
Thanks for that, Shoma.
Thank you, Shoma. Well, first of all, let me join her in praising your book. I mean, I've read your other books too, but this is fantastic. My little bone to be picked is, I was fascinated that you drew attention to Muziris, Kodungallur or Kranganore as it used to be called. But then I was a little puzzled that you talked about mathematics up in the north. You didn't mention the Kerala school at all. Was that conscious?
The Kerala school is very, very important, but it's much later.
Yeah, no,
it's much later, and I end my book in 1200. Otherwise, I would have included it most definitely. And it's a remarkable school, but it's outside my time boundary.
So Willie got an easy question to end on. But Willie, there's going to be a lot of other questions. We're going to open for cocktails. We have 2 fantastic speakers after this, so please grab a quick drink, get your book signed. And I just want to, while the hall is full, take this moment to say that on 22nd and 23rd of February, we are going to bring the 2nd edition of Synapse, which is about the intersection of science, technology, and society. And now that Willie has brought so much of spotlight into national pride around how we literally became the basis of modern science and technology across the world, I hope to see all of you there in large numbers. The cocktail bar is open, Willie is outside, and thank you very, very much.
Time for Johnny
Willie.
Walker.
Thank you.
When I grab people, when I dirty, when I mean, we love everybody, but we do as we please. When the weather's fine, we go fishing or go swimming in the sea.